The late October wind howled against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Reed Hayes' corner office, rattling glass that separated him from a 70-story drop. At 38, he had coded his first algorithm in a public library computer lab and turned it into a tech empire worth $3.2 billion. Yet tonight, staring at the security footage frozen on his screen, he felt like that foster kid again, the one who learned early that trust was just another word for weakness. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, replaying the timestamp for the fourth time. There she was, Vanessa Locke, his COO, his former lover, uploading terabytes of proprietary code to an encrypted server. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., 2 weeks ago. The IP address traced back to Julian Cross's private network. Mr. Hayes, his executive assistant Michelle's voice came through the intercom, carefully neutral. The emergency board meeting starts in 10 minutes. They're all here. Reed pressed the response button, his voice betraying nothing of the fury coiling in his chest. Tell them I'll be down in 5. And Michelle? Make sure legal documents are ready. He stood, adjusting his navy Bryony suit, armor, really, against a world that had taught him sentiment was a liability he couldn't afford. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him, a glittering testament to 15 years of ruthless ambition. Glass towers pierced the twilight sky, their windows blazing like the eyes of predators. 3 years ago, he'd stood in this exact spot with Vanessa, celebrating their Series D funding round, her laughter bright as champagne bubbles. Now those memories felt like malware, corrupting everything they touched. The leather folder on his desk contained more than financial forensics. Inside were screenshots, bank transfers, encrypted emails his security team had finally cracked. Vanessa hadn't just stolen code worth $400 million. She'd systematically dismantled his firewalls, created backdoors in his infrastructure, and sold his neural network architecture to cross industries piece by piece. The final insult? She'd done it while sharing his bed, his strategies, and his plans for the future. His phone vibrated with a text from his younger sister, Maya. Reed, please tell me you're not pulling another all-nighter. You're human, remember? Reed's jaw tightened. Humans. Sleep had become theoretical since that morning 3 weeks ago when his head of cybersecurity, Tom Chen, had knocked on his door at 6 a.m. with evidence that turned his world inside out. That day had started with coffee and code reviews. A routine Tuesday. Vanessa had called from London, or so she'd claimed, her face on his screen bright with excitement about the consulting contract she was finalizing. She looked radiant, energized. Only later, when Tom's preliminary report landed in his inbox with the subject line urgent, internal breach, executive level, did Reed understand the source of her glow. The betrayal wasn't merely personal. It was existential. Cross Industries had been circling Hayes Technologies for 5 years, trying to acquire, merge, or destroy him. What better infiltration strategy than to seduce the CEO's partner, gain root access to both his heart and his servers? Walking to the chrome bar cart near his desk, Reed poured 2 fingers of Japanese whiskey, aged 21 years, a gift from his first major investor. Never let them see the wound, the old venture capitalist had warned him. Sharks smell blood from miles away. The man had been right about predators. The whiskey burned down his throat as he caught his reflection in the darkened window. Shadows carved hollows beneath his ice-blue eyes, and his dark hair, usually immaculately styled, showed evidence of too many hours running his hands through it. He looked like what he was, a man betrayed. But he'd be damned if anyone in that boardroom saw him bleed. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Michelle's voice came through the door. "Sir?" "They're getting restless." "Let them wait," Reed said quietly, pulling up another file on his screen. This one was different. Not evidence of Vanessa's treachery, but a profile his head of HR had compiled at his request 3 days ago. A solution to the problem his board was about to present, the demand for stability, for proof that the Iron Fortress hadn't lost control. The profile photo showed a black woman with braided hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess the camera itself. Helen Carter, 29. Senior Cybersecurity Analyst. MIC graduate. Current employment, FreeSec Consulting. Her credentials were impeccable. Tom had worked with her on a security audit 2 years ago and called her the best code hunter I've ever seen. But it was the line at the bottom of her background check that had caught Reed's attention, subject currently refinancing assets to cover legal fees for brother Marcus Carter, currently appealing wrongful conviction. Estimated debt, $340,000 and climbing. Desperate. Brilliant. Vulnerable. Perfect. Reed closed the file and straightened his tie. The board wanted stability? They get a marriage. They wanted proof he could still lead? They'd see a CEO who treated relationships like any other business transaction, with clear terms, measurable outcomes, and no room for emotion. He'd learned his lesson about love. Now it was time to hire a wife. As he walked toward the door, his reflection in the window showed a man who'd conquered Silicon Valley through code and calculation. What it didn't show was the hollowness spreading through his chest, the creeping suspicion that in protecting his empire, he'd lost something he could never code back into existence. But sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not anymore. The boardroom was waiting. And after that, he had a very different kind of meeting to arrange, one where he'd offer Helen Carter $40 million and a 2-year contract to play the role of Mrs. Reed Hayes. He wondered if she'd see it for what it was, a devil's bargain. Or if, like him, she was desperate enough to sign anyway. The boardroom felt like a courtroom, and Reed Hayes knew he was the defendant. 12 faces watched him enter, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. The mahogany table stretched between them like a chasm, its polished surface reflecting the city lights bleeding through the windows. Reed took his seat at the head, noting who avoided his gaze. David Chen, his CFO, looked genuinely troubled. Margaret Whitmore, his oldest board member, seemed disappointed. But Richard Blackwell, venture capitalist and perpetual thorn in his side, wore the expression of a man who'd finally found his opening. "Gentlemen." "Margaret." Reed's voice cut through the murmuring. "I assume you've all reviewed the preliminary forensic report." Blackwell leaned forward, his silver cufflinks catching the light. "What we've reviewed, Hayes, is a catastrophe. Your COO, your handpicked second-in-command, has been bleeding this company dry for 6 months. The question isn't what she stole. It's how you didn't see it coming." The words hit their mark, but Reed kept his expression neutral. Vanessa Locke had executive clearance and 15 years of impeccable credentials. She exploited trust systematically built over. "She exploited you," Blackwell interrupted. "There's a difference between a security breach and sleeping with the enemy. Which, if the timeline in this report is accurate, you were." Literally. He'd crept up Reed's neck, but his voice remained steady. "My personal life has never interfered with my leadership of this company. Until it cost us $400 million in intellectual property." Margaret's voice was quieter than Blackwell's, but somehow more damaging. She'd been his father's friend, had voted to give Reed the CEO position when he was barely 30. Her disappointment felt personal. "Reed, dear, we're not just concerned about the breach. Cross Industries is circling. Our stock dropped 11% this week on rumors alone. Investors are nervous. They're asking if Hayes Technologies has become unstable." The word hung in the air like an indictment. David Chen cleared his throat, pulling up a presentation on the wall screen. "The damage assessment is still ongoing, but preliminary estimates suggest Vanessa accessed Project Cerebro's core architecture, our client database, and our 5-year development roadmap. If Cross reverse engineers even half of what she took, he won't." Reed's voice carried absolute certainty. "I've already initiated legal action. Federal investigators are involved. Vanessa's offshore accounts have been frozen, and Cross will face charges for corporate espionage." Blackwell snorted. "Legal battles take years. Meanwhile, our shareholders watch Hayes Technologies' golden boy unravel in real time. You're not married, Reed. No family. No stability. You've built your entire identity around this company, and now that image is cracked. Investors don't back broken men." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Reed's fingers pressed against the table's edge, the only outward sign of the rage burning through his chest. "Broken." The word echoed in his skull, mixing with every lesson his foster care years had taught him: show weakness, lose everything. Then I'll fix it. His voice cut through the tension like code through corruption. "You want stability? I'll give you stability. You want proof I'm still in control? You'll have it within the week." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Reed, what are you planning?" Reed stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. "A solution. Trust me." Blackwell's laugh was sharp. "Trust. That's rich, coming from a man whose judgment just cost us." "The meeting is adjourned." Reed's words carried finality as he walked toward the door, each step measured, controlled. "You'll have my proposal by Friday." He didn't wait for responses. Couldn't bear to see more doubt in faces that once held only respect. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. Michelle waited in the corridor, her expression carefully blank. "Sir, you have." "Get me Helen Carter's contact information," Reed interrupted. "Personal cell, not work number. And clear my schedule tomorrow afternoon." "Should I tell her what it's regarding?" Reed paused, his reflection ghosting across a darkened window. Somewhere in this city, a woman drowning in debt was working late, unaware her life was about to change. Unaware that the Iron Fortress had finally cracked, and was about to pull her into the rubble. "Tell her," he said quietly, "that Reed Hayes would like to discuss a mutually beneficial business opportunity." The fluorescent lights of FreeSec Consulting's basement office flickered at 11:47 p.m., casting shadows across Helen Carter's third cup of coffee. Her eyes burned from 8 straight hours of code review, but she couldn't stop now. Every hour of overtime was another $200 toward Marcus's legal fund. Every late night was another day closer to proving her brother's innocence. Her phone buzzed against the cluttered desk, vibrating between empty energy drink cans and printed case files. Unknown number. Helen almost ignored it. Creditors had gotten creative lately, but something made her swipe to answer. "Ms. Carter." A woman's voice, professional and oddly formal for midnight. "This is Michelle Vance, executive assistant to Reed Hayes of Hayes Technologies. Mr. Hayes would like to schedule a private meeting with you tomorrow at 2 p.m. He asked me to emphasize this is regarding a mutually beneficial business opportunity." Helen's hand froze on her mouse. Reed Hayes. The Reed Hayes. She'd done security consulting for his company 2 years ago, had been impressed by his infrastructure but had barely exchanged 10 words with the man himself. Billionaire tech CEOs didn't typically request personal meetings with contractors at midnight. What kind of opportunity? Helen's voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Hayes prefers to discuss details in person. Shall I confirm your attendance? A car will be sent to your office. Helen glanced at her reflection in the darkened monitor, bloodshot eyes, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, the same blazer she'd worn for 3 days straight because laundry meant quarters she needed for Marcus's commissary account. She looked like what she was, a woman barely holding it together. Yes. Confirm. The words left her mouth before her brain could catch up. Excellent. The driver will arrive at 1:30 p.m. Oh, and Miss Carter? Mr. Hayes asked me to mention he's aware of your brother's situation. He believes this opportunity might be timely. The line went dead before Helen could respond. Her brother's situation. The phrase hit like a punch to the gut. Marcus, 23, rotting in Rikers for a crime he didn't commit. A drug charge planted by cops who needed to close a case, believed by a jury who saw a young black man with a record of minor infractions and decided guilt was obvious. 3 years into a 10-year sentence, with appeals eating through money Helen didn't have. She pulled up Marcus's last letter, now crumpled from being read too many times. Sis, stop killing yourself for me. I see it in your eyes during visits. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. Please, just let it go. But letting go meant accepting that her baby brother, the kid who'd built computers from salvaged parts, who'd taught himself Python at 14, who'd dreamed of working at places like Hayes Technologies, would waste his youth in a cage. Helen's computer screen showed her current project, a penetration test for a mid-tier insurance company, paying barely enough to cover rent. Her side jobs, the late-night security audits, the weekend coding contracts, these kept the lawyers filing motions that went nowhere. Marcus's appeals attorney had been blunt last week. Without new evidence or significant funds for investigators, they were out of options. The financial spreadsheet on her second monitor told its own brutal story. Debt, $340,000 and climbing. Assets, $4,200. Credit cards, maxed. The eviction notice she'd hidden in her desk drawer gave her until the end of the month. Helen Carter, MIT graduate, cybersecurity expert, was drowning. And Reed Hayes somehow knew. She pulled up his profile on her screen, studying the sharp blue eyes that seemed to calculate even through corporate photography. The headlines from this week scrolled past: Hayes Technologies COO implicated in massive data breach. Reed Hayes empire under fire. Tech mogul's judgment questioned after betrayal. A man whose world was collapsing, calling a woman whose world had already collapsed. Mutually beneficial business opportunity. Helen wasn't naive. Men like Reed Hayes didn't offer salvation without strings attached. But drowning people couldn't afford to question the rope, even when they didn't know what it was tied to. She closed Marcus's letter and pulled up her calendar, blocking out tomorrow afternoon. Whatever Reed Hayes wanted, she'd listen. She had to. Because the alternative was watching her brother's hope die one appeal rejection at a time. And Helen Carter had already lost too much to pride. The black Mercedes arrived precisely at 1:30 p.m., as promised. Helen had changed into her only interview suit, pressed that morning with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The driver said nothing during the 20-minute ride to Hayes Technologies headquarters, a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. Reed Hayes' private office occupied the entire 72nd floor. Helen stepped off the elevator into a space that felt more like a luxury apartment than a workplace: exposed brick, minimalist furniture, and windows that turned Manhattan into a glittering toy city below. He stood with his back to her, silhouetted against that impossible view. "Miss Carter." He turned, and Helen understood immediately why people called him the Iron Fortress. Those blue eyes assessed her with the precision of code, calculating variables she couldn't see. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Helen remained standing. "Your assistant said this was about a business opportunity." "I'm a cybersecurity consultant, Mr. Hayes. If you need free sex services, there are proper channels. I need a wife." The words cut through her deflection like a blade. "For 2 years. $40 million, paid in full upon contract completion." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Helen's feet. She gripped the back of the leather chair, forcing her voice steady. "Excuse me." Reed moved to his desk, sliding a leather folder across its surface. "A contract marriage. Public appearances, social events, enough presence to satisfy my board of directors that I've achieved personal stability. In exchange, $40 million and the resources of Hayes Technologies at your disposal." Helen's laugh came out bitter, sharp. "You want to buy a wife like you'd buy a car? Is that what billionaires do when reality gets messy?" "Yes." No shame in his voice, no apology. "I've learned sentiment is expensive, Ms. Carter. I prefer transactions with clear terms." She should walk out. Every instinct screamed to leave this sterile office and its cold proposal behind. But $40 million. Marcus's freedom. The end of drowning. Helen opened the folder, scanning pages of legal text that reduced marriage to deliverables and KPIs. "I have conditions." Something flickered in Reed's eyes, surprise, perhaps. "You haven't agreed yet." "I haven't refused yet." Helen pulled a pen from her purse, her hand steady now. $40 million is generous, Mr. Hayes, but money alone isn't enough. I want full access to your legal team and private investigators. My brother Marcus is serving 10 years for a crime he didn't commit. I want your resources to investigate his case, find new evidence, and file proper appeals. Reed's expression didn't change, but she saw the calculation happening behind those ice-blue eyes. "And? After 2 years, you disappear from my life completely. No contact, no interference, no using whatever you learn about me during this arrangement. I want that ironclad in the contract, not as a clause, as the foundation. You're negotiating." He almost smiled. "Most people would simply take the money. Most people aren't me." Helen met his gaze without flinching. "I won't be bought, Mr. Hayes. But I might be hired if the terms are acceptable. I won't be your possession. I'll be your employee. There's a difference." Reed moved to the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "Done. My legal team will revise the contract by morning." "Anything else?" Helen thought of Marcus, of the spreadsheet of debt, of the eviction notice hidden in her desk. She thought of this man's cold eyes and colder proposition, and the dangerous game she was about to play. "Yes," she said quietly. "I want to know why me." Reed turned, and for the first time, something almost human crossed his face. "Because you're desperate enough to say yes, and smart enough to see the trap. That makes you exactly what I need." The honesty was somehow worse than a lie. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Hayes." "Reed," he corrected. "If you're going to be my wife, you should use my first name." Helen picked up the folder, holding his gaze. "I'll use your name when the contract is signed. Until then, you're just another client." She walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against marble that probably cost more than her yearly salary. Behind her, she felt his eyes tracking her movement, calculating, assessing. Helen Carter had just made a deal with the devil. She only hoped she'd survive collecting her payment. The penthouse was a monument to wealth Helen couldn't fathom, 20-foot ceilings, Italian marble, furniture that probably cost more than Marcus's entire legal defense. She'd signed the contract that morning in Reed's attorney's office, her signature transforming her from Helen Carter into Mrs. Helen Hayes with 40 million reasons to pretend. The wedding had been coldly efficient. City Hall, 2 witnesses pulled from Reed's legal team, vows that felt like terms of service. He'd kissed her for exactly 3 seconds, his lips as emotionless as his handshake afterward. The ring on her finger, a flawless 3-carat diamond, felt like a shackle dressed as jewelry. Now, at midnight, Helen sat at the guest room desk Reed had designated as her workspace, her laptop screen blurring as exhaustion crashed over her. His investigators had already sent preliminary files on Marcus's case, police reports, witness statements, forensic evidence. She'd been reading for 6 hours straight, cross-referencing timestamps, looking for the cracks in the prosecution story. Her eyes burned. The words swam together. Just 5 more minutes, she told herself. Just one more document. Helen's head dropped forward, her cheek pressing against the cool surface of the keyboard. She meant to rest for just a moment. Just a breath. Just. The sound of the door opening didn't wake her. Neither did the footsteps crossing the hardwood floor. What finally pulled her from unconsciousness was the sensation of being lifted, strong arms sliding beneath her knees and shoulders. What? Helen's eyes flew open to find Reed's face inches from hers, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You fell asleep on your keyboard," he said quietly, carrying her toward the bed. "You've been at it for hours." Helen's professional instinct kicked in despite her exhaustion. "The contract doesn't include carrying privileges." "Put me down." "The contract also doesn't include you working yourself into exhaustion on day 1. Reed set her on the bed with unexpected gentleness, stepping back immediately. "You're no use to either of us if you collapse." Helen sat up, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, her shoes already off, his tie loosened, the city lights painting shadows across his face. "Is this where you claim your contractual rights? Because I should tell you. I'm not staying." Reed's voice cut through her defensive speech. "Despite what you might think of me, I don't take what isn't freely given." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "The files will still be there tomorrow, Helen. Your brother's case won't be solved in one night. Every night I waste is another night he's in there." Her voice cracked despite her attempt at control. "You wouldn't understand." "You've never?" "I spent 3 years in foster care wondering if my sister would be placed in the same home or if I'd lose the only family I had left." Reed's words were quiet, almost conversational, but they landed like confessions. "I understand desperation, Helen. I understand what it means to fight for someone when the system has already decided their worth." Helen stared at him, this cold man who'd bought her like an asset, seeing something human flicker beneath the armor. "Then why stop me from working?" "Because burnt-out investigators miss details. Because you're more valuable to your brother alive and functional than martyred and broken." Reed's blue eyes held hers across the darkness. "And because despite what this contract says, I'm not a monster. I'm just a man who's learned to protect what's his." "I'm not yours," Helen said, but the words lacked conviction. "Not yet." Reed's smile was barely visible. "But we have 2 years to negotiate the terms." "Sleep, Helen. Tomorrow, we start the real work." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Helen sat in the darkness, her laptop still glowing on the desk, Marcus's file still waiting. But for the first time in years, she lay back against pillows that didn't smell like desperation and debt. And despite everything, the contract, the cold transaction, the dangerous game she'd agreed to play, Helen Carter fell asleep feeling something she'd almost forgotten. Safe. Helen had been Mrs. Hayes for 3 weeks when she found the ghost in the machine. Reed had granted her full access to Hayes' technology security infrastructure, partly because the contract stipulated her role as a legitimate employee, mostly because he'd admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability over Chinese takeout at 2 a.m., that he didn't trust his current team. Vanessa had poisoned too many wells. Now, at 3:47 a.m. in Reed's home office, Helen stared at code that shouldn't exist. She'd been running routine diagnostics, the kind of deep system sweeps that most companies skipped because they were tedious and time-consuming. But Helen had learned at MIT that the devil lived in the tedious details. The back door was elegant, she'd give Vanessa that. Buried 17 layers deep in the authentication protocols, disguised as legacy update functions that any cursory audit would skip over. But Helen wasn't cursory. She'd spent 6 hours tracing packet flows, and what she'd found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just data theft. This was an ongoing connection. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up network logs, cross-referencing access timestamps. The backdoor had been active for 8 months, not 6. And it wasn't just Vanessa's fingerprints in the code, there were at least 3 other distinct coding styles, which meant multiple actors. A coordinated team. Helen's screen filled with encrypted data streams, gigabytes flowing out of Hayes Technologies servers even now, weeks after Vanessa's exposure. She traced the destination IP addresses through 7 proxy servers before hitting a wall, military-grade encryption that would take months to crack. But one address had a flaw. A tiny mistake in the routing protocol that revealed a fragment of the actual destination. Cross Industries. Julian Cross's private R&D server farm. Jesus, Helen whispered, pulling up another terminal window. If the connection was still active, that meant someone else inside Hayes Technologies was still feeding data to Cross. Vanessa hadn't been the infiltration, she'd been the distraction. Helen dove deeper, her exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline sharpened her focus. She pulled up employee access logs, flagging anyone who'd accessed sensitive systems in the past month. 17 names appeared. She cross-referenced them against the backdoor's usage patterns, looking for overlap. 3 names lit up like fireworks. Thomas Way, Senior Network Engineer. Patricia Okonkwo, VP of Product Development. And David Chen, Chief Financial Officer. Helen's hands froze on the keyboard. David Chen. The man who sat on Reed's board, who'd looked genuinely troubled during that emergency meeting Reed had mentioned. Either Chen was an Oscar-worthy actor, or someone had compromised his credentials without his knowledge. She pulled up the network architecture, tracing data flows in real time, and found something that made her stomach drop. The backdoors weren't just stealing data, they were mapping Hayes Technologies' entire infrastructure. Every server, every security protocol, every defensive measure. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was reconnaissance for a takeover. Helen grabbed her phone, pulling up Reed's contact. Her finger hovered over the call button. It was nearly 4 a.m. He'd been in back-to-back meetings until midnight, was probably finally sleeping. But this couldn't wait. She pressed dial. Reed answered on the second ring, his voice rough but alert. Helen? What's wrong? Get to your office. Now. Helen was already pulling up additional screens, documenting everything. Vanessa wasn't working alone. The breach is still active. And Reed? It's worse than we thought. Much worse. How much worse? Helen stared at the network map on her screen, watching data packets flow out of Hayes Technology servers in real time, feeding intelligence to an enemy who was building a perfect blueprint for destruction. They're not trying to steal your technology anymore, she said quietly. They're building a key to burn your entire empire to the ground. They're calling it Operation Shadownet. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then, I'm on my way. Don't touch anything else until I get there. And Helen? Lock the office door. The line went dead. Helen sat in the darkness, watching the ghostly flow of stolen data, and realized that the dangerous secret she'd been hired to help solve had just become the thing that might destroy them both. Outside, Manhattan glittered like a city of lies. And somewhere in those glittering towers, Julian Cross was watching, waiting, building his arsenal from the code Helen had just exposed. The real war was just beginning. Reed arrived at the penthouse office in 12 minutes, still wearing the sweatpants and MIT hoodie he'd apparently slept in. Helen had never seen him anything less than immaculately dressed, and the glimpse of his humanity, tousled hair, bare feet, felt dangerously intimate. "Show me," he said simply, moving to stand behind her chair. Helen pulled up the network maps, walking him through the data streams, the multiple backdoors, the ongoing theft. Reed's hand gripped the back of her chair, his knuckles white as he processed what she'd found. "David Chen," he said finally, his voice hollow. "He's been with me since the beginning. His credentials might be compromised. Or," Helen pulled up another screen, "he might be complicit. I can't tell yet which." Reed's phone buzzed. Then again. And again. He pulled it from his pocket, his expression darkening as he read. "It's Michelle. There's been a break-in at your apartment. The police are there now." Helen's blood turned to ice. "What?" "Your building manager called Hayes Technology's main line when he couldn't reach you. They trashed everything, Helen. The police think they were looking for something. Her laptop. Her files. The preliminary evidence she'd been compiling on Marcus's case, the note she'd made about Hayes Technology's security vulnerabilities." Helen's vision tunneled as panic clawed up her throat. Reed's hand landed on her shoulder, grounding. "Breathe. Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it. Everything important is here or in cloud storage they can't access." Helen's phone lit up with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her swipe. Heavy breathing. Then a distorted voice, clearly using a modulator, "Back off the investigation, or your brother has an accident. Rikers is a dangerous place. Accidents happen every day." The line went dead. Helen's hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Reed took it from her, checking the call log, his jaw clenched with barely contained fury. "We're moving you full-time into the penthouse. Tonight. Non-negotiable." His voice was steel wrapped in ice. "That wasn't part of the contract." "Fuck the contract." Reed's curse startled her more than the break-in had. "They threatened your brother, Helen. They broke into your home. This stopped being a business arrangement the moment they made it personal." Helen wanted to argue, to maintain the professional distance that kept her sane in this impossible situation. But the modulated voice echoed in her skull. Marcus. Vulnerable. Trapped behind bars where she couldn't protect him. "I need to call the prison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Make sure he's okay. Make sure they flagged his file for extra monitoring." "Already done." Reed held up his phone. "I texted my head of security while you were processing. Marcus has been moved to protective custody as of 10 minutes ago. Private cell, guards we've personally vetted. His safe. The efficiency should have felt cold, transactional. Instead, Helen felt something crack in her chest, the armor she'd maintained since signing that contract, the distance she'd insisted on preserving. Reed Hayes had protected her brother before she'd even asked. Had anticipated her fear and neutralized it with the ruthless precision he applied to everything. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. The contract doesn't require you to. Because you're my wife. Reed's eyes held hers, and for the first time, the title didn't sound like a business term. Even if it's pretend, even if it's temporary, while you wear that ring, what threatens you threatens me. That's not negotiable, Helen. That's non-optional. Helen looked at the diamond on her finger, catching the glow of her laptop screen. 3 weeks ago, this ring had felt like beautiful handcuffs. Now it felt like a promise she hadn't known she needed. They're escalating, she said quietly, turning back to the network maps. The break-in, the threat, they know we're getting close to something they can't afford us to find. Reed moved to the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The penthouse felt different now that Helen lived there completely. Her books mingled with his tech journals on the shelves. Her favorite tea appeared in the kitchen cabinet. Small invasions of domesticity that blurred the careful lines they'd drawn. 3 days after the break-in, Helen found Reed on the balcony at 2 a.m., staring at the city with a glass of whiskey in his hand and ghosts in his eyes. She'd been reviewing Marcus's case files, unable to sleep, when she'd heard the sliding door open. She almost went back inside. Privacy was the currency they'd agreed to trade in. But something about the slump of his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the railing like it was the only thing keeping him anchored, made her step outside. Can't sleep. Helen wrapped her cardigan tighter against the October wind. Reed didn't turn. I keep thinking about all the ways I missed it. The late meetings Vanessa claimed were with clients. The encrypted calls she said were NDAs. I built my entire empire on reading code, on seeing patterns, and I missed the most obvious one. She was good at hiding, Helen offered, moving to stand beside him. That's what made her dangerous. My first foster home, Reed said suddenly, his voice distant, the father was a computer programmer. Good guy, patient, taught me basic coding when I was 8. I thought maybe they'd keep me, that I'd finally found something permanent. He took a drink, the whiskey catching the city lights. They sent me back 6 months later. Budget cuts, they said. I learned then that nothing was permanent. Everything was conditional. Helen's chest tightened at the image of a child learning that love had terms and conditions. I met Vanessa when I was 26, Reed continued. Just starting Hayes Technologies with nothing but code and audacity. She was a consultant, brilliant, saw the potential in what I was building. We grew together, the company, the relationship, everything intertwined. When she left, it wasn't just betrayal. It was proof that I'd been right all along. Trust was just another word for future damage. Is that why you bought a wife? Helen asked quietly. So you could control the terms of the damage. Reed finally looked at her, and the rawness in his eyes made her breath catch. I bought a wife because it was safer than earning one. Because contracts can't break your heart the way people can. He paused. I was wrong. Helen's pulse quickened. Reed. Your turn. His voice was gentle but insistent. I know you're investigating more than just Marcus's case. You disappear for hours with encrypted files you think I don't notice. Whatever you're hiding, Helen, they already know about it. That's why they threatened him. Helen's hands tightened on the railing. She'd kept this secret for 3 weeks, buried beneath layers of encryption and caution. But Reed had just handed her his scars. The least she could do was offer her own. Before I accepted your contract, I'd been investigating Hayes Technologies independently, she admitted, the words tasting like betrayal. Not for money. For evidence. Marcus's arrest, the cops who framed him were moonlighting as private security. Guess who they worked for? Reed's expression didn't change, but she felt the tension radiating from him. Tell me. Cross Industries. I found financial records linking them to the precinct, payments buried in security contracts. I think Marcus saw something he shouldn't have during a consulting job, and they silenced him the easiest way they knew how. Helen's voice cracked. I've been trying to prove it for 3 years. When you offered me access to your resources, I thought. You thought you could use my war with Cross to save your brother. Reed's voice was unreadable. Yes. No point in lying now. I'm sorry. I should have told you from the beginning, but you didn't trust me. Reed set down his glass, turning to face her fully. You saw a cold bastard buying a wife, and you thought you'd exploit the transaction for your own purposes. Shame burned through Helen's chest. I'm sorry. Don't be. Reed's hand came up, cupping her face with unexpected gentleness. You did exactly what I would have done. You saw an opening and took it. That's not betrayal, Helen. That's survival. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. And it means we're hunting the same monster. Helen's eyes stung with unshed tears. You're not angry. I'm furious, Reed said softly. But not at you. At Cross, for what he did to Marcus. At Vanessa, for selling us out. At myself, for being so locked in my own fortress that you felt you had to hide this. His forehead rested against hers. No more secrets between us. Whatever we're facing, we face it together. Contract or not. The kiss happened without decision, without thought. Reed's lips met hers with a desperation that matched her own, 3 weeks of careful distance shattering like glass. Helen stared at the 2 pink lines, her hands trembling so badly the test clattered against the bathroom sink. This wasn't possible. They'd been careful. Mostly careful. Except for that night on the balcony, and the morning after when Reed had pulled her back to bed with kisses that tasted like promises, and the dozen other times when careful had seemed less important than the desperate need to feel something real. The pregnancy test sat on the marble counter like evidence of a crime. 6 weeks. She'd been Reed's wife for 6 weeks, and somewhere between the contract and the conspiracy, between the danger and the late-night strategy sessions, they'd stopped pretending. A knock on the bathroom door made her jump. Helen? Tom just sent the decrypted files from Cross's server. We have him. Reed's voice carried triumph and exhaustion. We finally have enough to. Helen opened the door. Reed's expression shifted from excitement to concern in a heartbeat as he took in her tear-streaked face, the test still clutched in her hand. What's wrong? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him like he could contain whatever bomb was about to detonate. Then his eyes dropped to the test, and Helen watched comprehension dawn across his features like a sunrise. Is that positive? The word came out strangled. I'm pregnant, Reed. I'm carrying your child, and we have a contract that expires in 22 months, and Cross is about to go to war with us, and I don't, her voice broke. I don't know how to do this. Reed took the test from her shaking hands, setting it carefully on the counter. Then he did something that shattered her completely. He smiled. Not the calculated expression he used in board meetings, but something genuine and terrified and achingly vulnerable. "I grew up in foster care because my parents died in a car accident when I was 7, he said quietly, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I swore I'd never bring a child into uncertainty, never risk making them feel the way I felt, unwanted, temporary, conditional." His thumb brushed away her tears. "But Helen, nothing about you has ever been temporary. Not since the moment you negotiated that contract like you were negotiating a treaty, not since you fell asleep on your keyboard fighting for your brother, not since you found Operation Shadownet and trusted me with the truth. The contract. Fuck the contract." Reed's forehead rested against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you. I've loved you since you demanded more than money, since you refused to be bought. The contract was my armor, Helen, but you got through it anyway." Helen's hands fisted in his shirt, torn between hope and terror. "We're about to destroy Cross. He's not going to go quietly. There will be legal battles, maybe physical danger. I can't bring a baby into our baby." Reed's hand moved to her stomach, still flat but holding their impossible future. Not a contract obligation. Not a transaction. Ours. A crash from somewhere in the penthouse made them both freeze. Reed's hand flew to his phone, pulling up the security feed. Helen watched over his shoulder as the screen showed 3 figures in tactical gear moving through the lower level. "They found us," she whispered. Reed was already moving, pulling her toward the panic room hidden behind the bedroom bookshelf. "Tom's files. They can't let that evidence go public." He pressed his palm to the biometric scanner, the wall sliding open to reveal a reinforced steel room. "Get inside. Lock it behind me. If I'm not back in 10 minutes. No." Helen grabbed his arm. "We do this together. That's what you said. No more fortresses." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made the decision for them. Reed pulled Helen into the panic room, the door sealing behind them with a hydraulic hiss. Through the security monitors, they watched 3 men search the penthouse with military precision. Reed's phone lit up with a text from an unknown number, the files for the girl and the baby. "You have 30 seconds to decide." Helen's blood turned to ice as she realized Cross knew. Knew about the pregnancy. Knew about the evidence. Knew exactly which pressure points to hit. Reed's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers lacing together. "They're not getting any of it," he said quietly. "Not the files, not you, not our child." "Then what do we do?" Reed pulled up his phone, fingers flying across the screen. "We stop playing defense. Tom has the evidence. The FBI is already en route. Cross doesn't know that part." He looked at her, his blue eyes fierce in the monitor's glow. "We end this tonight. Together." Helen pressed her free hand to her stomach, where their impossible future was growing despite contracts and conspiracies. "Together," she agreed. Outside, Cross's men were tearing apart their home. But inside the panic room, Reed Hayes and Helen Carter were planning a war. And this time, they were fighting for more than empires. They were fighting for family. The Hayes Technologies boardroom had never felt this crowded. Every board member sat in their designated chair, but now they were flanked by FBI agents, securities investigators, and 2 U.S. attorneys whose presence transformed the space from corporate theater into a courtroom. Julian Cross sat across from Reed with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Vanessa Locke sat beside him, her expression carefully neutral. David Chen looked genuinely shocked, his credentials having been compromised exactly as Helen had suspected. The other infiltrators, Thomas Way and Patricia Okonkwo, had been arrested at their homes 2 hours before dawn. Reed stood at the head of the table, Helen beside him. She wore a navy dress that almost hid her 12-week pregnancy, her hand resting protectively over the subtle curve. The diamond on her finger caught the morning light, no longer feeling like a prop but a promise. "Gentlemen, Margaret," Reed began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd stopped playing defense. "Thank you for attending this emergency session. I believe you'll find the evidence compelling." Tom Chen pulled up the first slide, network diagrams showing the intricate web of Operation Shadownet. Every board member leaned forward, their expression shifting from confusion to horror as the scope of the breach became clear. "For the past 8 months," Helen spoke up, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the room, "Hayes Technologies has been systematically infiltrated. Not just for data theft, but for complete corporate destruction. Mr. Cross and Ms. Locke orchestrated a conspiracy that involved placing compromised employees, creating backdoors in critical systems, and building a blueprint to dismantle this company from within." Cross's lawyer stood. "This is a spurious accusation without evidence." Reed smiled, sliding a folder across the table. "We have encrypted communications between Cross Industries and Ms. Locke dating back 14 months. We have financial transfers totaling $42 million. We have the backdoors themselves, still active, still transmitting data to servers registered under Cross Industries shell companies." The U.S. attorney added, "We also have evidence of conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, wire fraud, and," she glanced at Helen, "obstruction of justice in an unrelated criminal case." Cross's confidence finally cracked. "What case?" Helen pulled up a new slide, and her hands only shook slightly. 3 years ago, Marcus Carter was arrested on drug charges. The arresting officers were employed by Cross Industries as private security. My brother witnessed illegal data transfers during a consulting job at a Cross Industries subsidiary. You silenced him by planting evidence and ensuring his conviction." The room erupted. Margaret Whitmore's hand flew to her mouth. Richard Blackwell, for once, had nothing cutting to say. The FBI agents moved almost imperceptibly closer to Cross and Vanessa. "That's absurd," Cross snarled. "You have no proof." "We have the financial records," Reed interrupted, his voice ice. "Payments to the officers. Encrypted communications discussing the Carter problem. And as of this morning, we have a signed confession from Officer Derek Morrison, who agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence." Helen's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. "Marcus. Free. After 3 years of fighting, of drowning in debt, of late nights and desperate hope, finally, justice." The conspiracy extended beyond corporate espionage, the U.S. attorney continued. 3 nights ago, operatives employed by Mr. Cross broke into Mrs. Hayes' former residence and made threats against Mr. Carter while he was in custody. That constitutes witness intimidation and attempted obstruction. Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice desperate. "I'll cooperate. I'll testify against Cross. I have documents, recordings." "Too late for deals," Reed said quietly. "You burned that bridge when you threatened my wife and child." The word "a child" rippled through the room. Margaret's eyes dropped to Helen's stomach, and her expression softened. Even Blackwell looked uncomfortable, as if threatening a pregnant woman crossed some line that corporate warfare didn't. Cross stood abruptly, but FBI agents were already moving. "Julian Cross, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation." As they read him his rights, Cross locked eyes with Reed. "You think you've won? I'll bury you in legal fees. I'll drag this out for years. I'll destroy everything. You already tried that, Helen said quietly, stepping forward. You stole his technology, corrupted his company, threatened his family. And you still lost. Because love isn't a liability, Mr. Cross. It's the one thing you can't steal, corrupt, or destroy. Reed's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together as Cross was led away in handcuffs. Vanessa followed, her elegant composure finally cracking into tears. The board sat in stunned silence until Margaret spoke. Reed, I believe we owe you an apology. And our full support. Agreed, Blackwell said grudgingly. For what it's worth, Hayes, you've proven your judgment is sound. In business and he glanced at Helen, in matters of the heart. Reed's arm wrapped around Helen's waist, pulling her close. If we're done here, I have somewhere more important to be. 20 minutes later, they stood outside Rikers Island as Marcus Carter walked through the gates a free man. Helen's brother was thinner than she remembered, older in ways that had nothing to do with years. But his eyes, God, his eyes were alive again with hope she'd thought prison had killed. Sis? Marcus's voice broke as Helen ran to him, throwing her arms around him with a ferocity that made her ribs ache. You're free. It's over. You're finally free. Marcus held her, his shoulders shaking with sobs 3 years in the making. When he finally pulled back, his eyes found Reed standing a respectful distance away. You're the CEO. The one who married your sister, yes. Reed extended his hand. And the one who's offering you a job at Hayes Technologies once you're ready. Senior Systems Analyst position. No pressure, no timeline. Just an open door. Marcus stared at the offered hand, then at Helen, then back at Reed. Why? You don't even know me. I know you were willing to go to prison rather than compromise your ethics. I know your sister fought for 3 years to free you, and that kind of loyalty doesn't come from nowhere. Reed's expression softened. And I know you're about to be an uncle. My child deserves family who understands the difference between right and wrong, even when the cost is everything. Helen's hand moved to her stomach, and Marcus's eyes followed the gesture. His face transformed, shock, joy, disbelief cycling across his features. You're pregnant? Helen, he pulled her into another embrace. I'm so happy for you. Both of you. 6 months later, Reed and Helen stood in the renovated nursery of their penthouse, no longer his, but theirs, watching their daughter sleep. Ava Hayes had her mother's determination, already gripping her father's finger with surprising strength. The board approved the new security protocols today, Reed said quietly, his free arm wrapped around Helen's waist. And Marcus officially accepted the promotion to Director of Cybersecurity. He's good at it, Helen said, leaning into her husband's warmth. Almost as good as his sister. His sister, Reed corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple, is the reason any of us are still standing. The reason Cross is serving 15 years. The reason I learned that the strongest fortress isn't built from walls, but from trust. Helen turned in his arms, studying the man who'd once tried to buy a wife and ended up earning a family. No regrets about the contract. Only that I didn't tear it up the first night, when I realized you were never going to be just an employee. Reed's hand cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. I love you, Helen Hayes. Not because of what you've done for me or my company, but because you saw a cold bastard buying a wife and decided to teach him how to be human again. Their kiss was interrupted by Ava's cry. Helen moved to the crib, lifting their daughter with the practiced ease of 6 months' experience. Reed watched them, his wife, his daughter, the family he'd never believed he deserved, and felt the last of his armor finally crack apart. The Iron Fortress had fallen. And in its place stood something infinitely stronger, a man who'd learned that love wasn't a transaction to be managed, but a force that transformed everything it touched. Outside, Manhattan glittered with infinite possibility. Inside, the Hayes family had everything they'd fought for: justice, freedom, and a future built not on contracts, but on the dangerous, beautiful truth that some things were worth more than empires. Some things were worth everything. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.